Have you noticed how weirdly gendered politics has become lately? I hadn't really noticed it until I was at a meeting for the organization I'm a part of. It's called the Center for Political Innovation. And a member, he was talking about recruitment, and he said, well, it's really hard to go out and recruit in leftist spaces, Palestine rallies, etc., because most leftists are women, and they don't really want to be in a male-dominated org. And I thought about it, and yeah, so much of the political conversations that we have lately have become gendered. Tons of people are pointing this out lately. In fact, there's even data to support this. Gen Z men especially are skewing 10 to 20% more conservative than their female counterparts, whereas Gen Z women tend to skew in the opposite direction, with nearly 40 to 60 point difference, with them skewing liberal or left wing. So I looked into explanations for why. And all of them seemed really moralizing. They seemed moralizing and self-serving. So, of course, conservatives, they say, oh, well, the reason men are more conservative is because they're practical and they're used to having to fend for themselves. And so they tend to identify with conservatism more. And, of course, women, on the other hand, liberals, they'll say, oh, well, women, they just have more empathy and smelly, they're used to... they're smarter and they're more empathetic, and they can identify with people who have been like oppressed, smelly, and so that's why they tend to be more liberal. And what both sides of these explanations do is they're engaging in an abstract moralism. And that assumes that the side you identify with is right, and that if someone were to disagree with you, well, it must be because of a personal fault. And the truth is, politics has a lot less to do with the kind of person you are morally, and a lot more to do with material incentives. You know, my background is in Marxism, and what most Marxists think is a quote-unquote class analysis is actually this very same kind of abstract moralism. They abstract the example of the employer and employee relationship, and then they try to force this onto all of the society through this very crude moralistic lens, where employer is code for bad person because of the exploitative relationship they have with their employee. And employee is code for good person because they're viewed as a victim, and we all know how much the left loves a good victim. We won't be doing any of that here because it's unhelpful, and in my opinion, it's in many cases outdated. So, what is a real class analysis? What is class analysis? Well, class analysis is very simple. It basically just says that the way a person makes a living, their relationship to the economy, has predictive power over the way that they will act. And that most people, in most situations, are going to act in their own self-interest because that is how incentive structures work. And that by understanding how a person is materially incentivized, that can tell us a lot about the way in which they will act, and a lot about society. Now, that's not to say that people are incapable of acting against their own self-interest. In fact, ideology can play a large part in how people act too. Frederick Engels, for example, the primary sponsor of Marx and the founder of the Second International, he was a factory owner. But most people, in most situations, are just going to act in their own self-interest. So the point of a class analysis is to take the conversation away from good people and bad people. And we really need to come to an understanding of why it is that people are behaving the way that they are, and what that can tell us about how we, as people who are anti-imperialists, who are against the wars of aggression that the United States is raging around the world, how we can intervene in the political struggle. In the United States, at least, left and right map pretty cleanly onto the two major parties, Democrat and Republican parties. And that while the extremes on either side may denounce the parties in the abstract, the real role they're playing on the far left is that of being a super Democrat. They disagree with the Democratic Party because they feel that they're not Democrats enough. And on the far right, white nationalists, etc., they are super Republicans. They disagree with the Republicans because they feel that they're not Republican enough. And they're playing this game where they're pretending to be independent, but they're not seriously independent. They're not playing a seriously independent role, and so I'm not going to treat them as independent. And if we're to understand why it is that genders have become split along these lines, we'll have to understand the structure of each party from a class perspective and the interests each party is appealing to. Because both parties in the United States are parties of very wealthy, very powerful people. But unfortunately, or for them, those wealthy, powerful people represent a tiny, tiny minority of the population. And America has to represent this veneer of a republic, of a democracy in which the people rule. And so both sides are going to mobilize underlings to act in their own interest and form coalitions that are acting in the interests of the people at the very top. So we'll start with the Democratic Party, and then we'll move on to the Republican Party. And the Democratic Party, as both parties have, has changed a lot in the last 100 years. But at the moment, the Democratic Party is the party of the ultra-rich, of the managerial bourgeoisie. Now, at the top, you have finance capital, which has come out of the 5 major, super major oil companies and the families that started those businesses, the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, the DuPonts, the ultra-rich, people who we have no idea how much money they even have. And they began as an industrial economy, diversified itself out into finance capital. That's what Lenin described in his theory of imperialism, how industrial and finance capital merge, and that this is the basis of imperialism. But below the ultra monopolies, Chase Bank, etc., Goldman Sachs, BlackRock, below them, you have the tech monopolists and the tech companies that have often been sponsored by the US government in many cases to operate. And that's why Al Gore famously said that we invented the internet. But you have the tech monopolists, the people in charge of Facebook and Google, Twitter, X, your Elon Musks, your Mark Zuckerbergs, your Jeff Bezoses. They're below the tech monopolists, and they operate on the same level of a very, very old faction within the Democratic Party, which is the urban political machines. And both of these people have people beneath them. So underneath the tech monopolists, and this is a more sophisticated, more modern thing, you have the NGO apparatus, the university system, etc., and the class of people with, quote, professional managerial jobs, the quote-unquote laptop class, the kind of person who goes through the university system and ends up with a job at one of these liberal NGOs supporting LGBT rights or supporting, voting registration campaigns or some other nonprofit or tech job, working for Google coding. Then you have the urban political machines, and they have people beneath them, which tends to be the trade union bureaucracy, and you have local government employees who are also part of their own union bureaucracy. Now, the people within the NGO apparatus, the professional managerial class, the laptop class, are going to be much less likely to dissent, and that's for a number of reasons. For one, they're the kind of people who very much value respectability and credentials. They tend to be more trustful of institutions because their entire being as a class is tied to that credentialism. The class position that they operate in, their standard of living, is tied to them having that job at that NGO and the credential that they earned at that university. And that while they still have the employee-employer relationship, their relationship to politics has been changed by this institution, which mediates their position within society. So, in the beginning, the university system has been used to test their conformity, their ability to enter into the professional managerial class, to say the right things, to get their degree, etc. That's before they've even entered their class position. But what's more is their class position itself is tied to being viewed as a cosmopolitan person who's above the ignorant rabble. And so they're much less likely to dissent because of that. And that's not because they're bad people. The professional managerial class is a class of people who have these university degrees, who are constantly kept in this state of precarity. That's one of the reasons why they will never do student debt forgiveness, because student debt and the debts that they've accumulated in order to earn their credentials and earn their higher paying job and the prestige that is associated with that job, that which has enabled them to rise to their position in the first place, is constantly being held over their head. It's the only kind of debt that you can't file for bankruptcy from. And if you don't, your credit score will go down. It'll be difficult for you to receive housing, etc. And they have this massive payment dangled over their head constantly. And they know that if they lose their job, they will no longer be able to pay that debt. And in these kinds of jobs, it's not uncommon for somebody to lose it, for saying something that is not politically correct, for saying something that is against the foreign policy establishment of the United States. But that's not to say that the professional managerial class, because of their class position, is all bad. They do tend to be more open to regulation or new social ideals because of the atmosphere of academia, which on paper is supposed to encourage them to question more. And because the monopolists tend to be the ones writing regulation laws, they tend to have less of an issue or resentment towards those laws being written. And so they're less open to the idea of free market capitalism and the harmful ideas associated with austerity. They're also not threatened by trade unionism. They tend to view it as a positive good, and they may have even studied the history of trade unionism or the history that the labor struggle has with anti-racist politics in the United States. So why is it that women are overwhelmingly part of the professional managerial class and overwhelmingly Democrats? Well, women just tend to be better at navigating these bureaucratic institutions. And that's for a number of reasons. And this happens all over the place. Women are overwhelmingly overrepresented in higher education all around the world. And this even goes for countries that the United States government has told us are oppressing women. In Iran, for example, 60% of the people in higher education are women. And actually, it's gotten to the point where they've had to do like reverse DEI to allow men to get a higher education, because they're simply just not as good as navigating these institutions as women are. And that this is because a lot of the way in which society socializes women is centered around things like obedience and agreeableness. And that for those reasons, women tend to score higher in those areas. And these are things that bureaucratic institutions really value: your ability to follow instructions and do things and not deviating too much from the mean. We also know from simple demographic data that for whatever reason, and again, this might be socialization, women tend to be more sociable, etc., women tend to cluster towards the middle of bell curve tables. That is to say, there are fewer outliers. And bureaucracies love average people. The people at Harvard, we have this popular view in American society that they're the best, they're the brightest, they're the smartest people. They actually tend to be the most average people, because a bureaucracy is very good at accounting for an average person, but it has a lot of difficulty accounting for people who have exceptional ability or who have exceptional lack of ability. And that being the kind of person that the bureaucracy has accounted for has a lot of advantages and will allow you to navigate it more effectively. Moving on to the Republican Party. Why is it that the Republican Party is so dominated by men? The Republican Party is the party of the rich, the regular rich, not the ultra-rich. It is the party of the quote-unquote entrepreneurial bourgeoisie. Now this, at the very top, is industrialists, weapons contractors, industrialists, the fracking cowboys out in Arizona, your Fred Kochs, etc. This is what people like Carol Quigley would refer to as new money. And it is a much broader and looser coalition. Below them, you have a broad coalition of what we would call petty bourgeois proprietors. That at the top you have your Betsy DeVosses, who runs Amway, your My Pillow guys, and below them you have just this broad group of like petty bourgeois proprietors. That's like people in the fitness industry, maybe a personal trainer, shop owners, contractors. Marjorie Taylor Greene, for example, her husband owns a construction company. Content creators, restaurant owners, etc. A petty bourgeois proprietor is a person who maybe is able to draw a salary, maybe they even have a substantial amount of capital, but it's not enough for them to compete with the monopolism, and it's not a business that could necessarily scale itself upwards, and that the wealth that they've acquired tends to be entrepreneurial. It's something that they have started themselves or through family connections, and it's much more insecure in its ability to hold on to itself because it's so new. Increasingly, below even them, and this is because of the changing nature of the economy, because of the way in which technology is developing, you have this strata of gig economy workers, Uber drivers, people who drive for Amazon Flex, Door Dashers, etc. And that gig workers have a relationship similar to the professional managerial class, actually, that in many ways resembles the classic employer-employee relationship. But like the professional managerial class, it's a relationship that's mediated by an institution. In this case, the apps through which they're doing their gig hustle work through. And because is mediated by this institution, its character has changed. Gig workers do not perceive themselves to be workers, and they don't tend to have solidarity with other gig workers. In fact, they view themselves to be in competition with other workers, and they're constantly hustling to find new ways to outcompete each other. They have constructed an ideology around hustling. In many ways, despite being downwardly mobile and not having the economic freedom of maybe the rest of the petty bourgeoisie, and that because of that ideology and because of the way these apps encourage competition amongst each others, and because you quote-unquote set your own hours, they have a lot of the same tendencies of a petty bourgeois proprietor. The petty bourgeoisie are a lot less concerned about managing the United States as a global empire or the institutions associated with it. In fact, they're much more concerned about making money. And that you can really view the difference between the managerial bourgeoisie and the entrepreneurial bourgeoisie as the difference between a global chessboard, as in the Brzezinski school, many of whom advise the Democrats, and military interventionism. Have you ever noticed how during Democratic administrations, the Carter administration, the Biden administration, the Obama administration, these administrations are going to be much less likely than Republican administrations to start a bunch of like tiny wars against small anti-imperialist countries. But they are going to escalate military conflict with the big players in the world, your Russias and your Chinas. That during the Biden administration, we started the Ukraine proxy war and really escalated to the verge of World War II. We were sending senators to Taiwan to escalate with China, but we really didn't escalate so much with countries like Cuba, Venezuela, or Iran. And on the other hand, when Trump comes into office, he starts some very promising peace talks with Russia and stops escalating the China conflict. But on the other hand, he kidnaps Nicolas Maduro. He, starts a color revolution in Iran to overthrow the Islamic Republic. He enforces a brutal embargo a genocidal embargo on the Cuban people. Similar thing happened in the 1970s. You had the Carter administration, which started the Afghan trap and was trapping the Soviet Union and really moving towards winning the Cold War, escalating with the Soviet Union. But Carter brags that he's the only president who didn't start a new war. And on the other hand, you had during the Reagan administration, who, yes, he escalated the nuclear arms race, but there was also a lot of arms control treaties that were signed with the Soviet Union and friendship deals that were signed. And on the other hand, he also invaded Grenada and did an intervention in Panama and et cetera, et cetera. The petty bourgeoisie is very short-term oriented, whereas the entrepreneurial bourgeoisie is long-term oriented. The petty bourgeoisie are concerned with making money. The managerial bourgeoisie are concerned with maintaining their status. And that because of this, the petty bourgeoisie feel resentment because they're concerned with making money. They feel resentment towards the regulations, the red tape, towards trade unions, all of which they see as an inhibition towards their own upward mobility. The petty bourgeoisie are distrustful of institutions and often reflexively anti-establishment. But this often leads to conspiratorial worldviews. They tend to collapse the management of the economy by finance capital in order to maintain stability into a communist conspiracy to keep them poor. And that their mental blocks around communism can often push them to tacitly support U.S. imperialism against countries like China or Venezuela. And it also lends itself to the free market ideology, which is used to push austerity and degrowth and decreasing living standards. In fact, their obsession with free trade and deregulation actually often furthers the lowering of their own living standards. In fact, their obsession with free trade and deregulation actually often further lowers their living standards and pushes them towards austere living. But men are increasingly falling into this category as bureaucratic institutions leave them behind, and they are sucked into either the entrepreneurial bourgeoisie or into the strata of downwardly mobile gig workers. Men are socialized from a young age to value things like independence or work ethic, making the ideology surrounding this class strata more appealing. I want to be very clear that these traits that I'm describing are innate neither to men or women, but that it most likely comes from socialization, although I don't claim to know. I'm not a psychologist. And for whatever reason, there are more outliers in capability amongst men, both as far as behavior and capability. Men tend to be the outliers on the bell curve. You have a lot more upstanding citizens among men, but you also have a lot more violent criminals amongst men. You have a lot more geniuses amongst men, but you also have a lot more dumbasses among men. And that makes institutions less likely to properly funnel them into the professional managerial class because these bureaucratic institutions, they love an average. They love something that's measurable and easy, and men oftentimes don't fit into that. Right? The point of all of this is to get you to stop moralizing about politics and to understand that the reason people are acting the way that they are tends to be because they're acting in their own self-interest, in their own class interest. And where does this leave us as people with anti-imperialist politics, with people who are against the wars that our government is waging against around the world, who want infrastructure in the United States, who want development in the United States? Because neither of these factions that have been mobilized by the larger factions within the ruling class are perfect. And it's our job to go in and understand why they hold the positions that they do, understand the resentments that they have, the fears that they have, and where there are openings for us. On the left, for example, you have people who are much more likely to listen to you talk about the struggle of the Palestinian people and how the United States government has been funding a genocide against the Palestinian people. There are tons of people on the left who are open to hearing that messaging. On the right, too, but it is mostly coded as a left-wing issue. Similarly, they might be open to hearing you talk about the amazing advances the Venezuelan government has made and how it is criminal for our government to be waging a war against the Venezuelan people while people in our own country starve on the streets. And on the opposite end, the entrepreneurial bourgeoisie, because they're just interested in making money, they may be less likely to want to hear you talk about Venezuela, which they think is a communist country or whatever. But they might be willing to talk to you about a country like Russia and how the funding of a proxy war in Ukraine, arming neo-Nazis to murder ethnically Russian people, is wrong, and that our government could be spending that money to end the homelessness crisis, to invest in our own people again, rather than trying to manage a global economy. And that you have to go among the people on both sides of the aisle and stop with this idea that it's because one side is bad and one side is wrong. And that by conducting a class analysis, by understanding why it is that people think what they think, that can give you clarity into how it is that you can appeal to these people. On what level can you appeal to them? That is really important. That is how politics. Now, as I had mentioned earlier, I'm an organization. It's called the Center for Political Innovation. We do this kind of anti-imperialist work. And I invite you to join me. There's a link in the description. Thanks for watching.